Welcome to the podcast. Everyone is talking about God. I'm Damon, and me and my friend Kayla interviewed my friend Tim Burnett to talk about pastoring with this God after sovereignty. Okay, everyone, this is the last episode in this 4-part series of interviews about God after sovereignty. We've had some pretty amazing interviews so far, but these interviews we've done so far have been with theologians and philosophers, people who work in academia and not necessarily in, church. We're all talking about religion, and when people think of religion, people, at least normal people, think of church usually. And here's the thing. There is a way to talk about this stuff outside of academia in a normal face-to-face community environment. And my good friend Tim Burnett, we got on the podcast to talk about that. He's a pastor in Santa Barbara, and I live in Santa Maria. It's an hour away. And I'm actually a part of his community now in Santa Barbara. So when he's talking about the community and what it's like and how they do their gatherings, picture me there too. So he's a homie. And this interview was in person in Santa Barbara with me and Kayla, back when Kayla was a part of the podcast, because we actually recorded this quite a long time ago. I don't know, last year, maybe like 6 months ago. And yeah, we've been sitting on these interviews since we went on a break, and now we get to put all of these out there. And this is the last interview that I had to put out there of all the interviews we recorded a long time ago. And I really love this one because, like I was saying, we get into the more practical nature of talking about this God after sovereignty. A little less in all the theories and philosophy and into the real relationship side of this and leading a community talking about God in this way. So I'm super excited for you guys to listen to it. Thank you so much for listening to this whole series. And Tim also has a podcast called the Theopoetics Podcast, so go look that up as well. In this interview, there's a part where he says there's only a few episodes up now. Now there's a few more episodes. And one of the recent episodes was with Bo Sanders, and in part of our interview, he talks about how Bo Sanders has inspired him in this language about Church 1.0 and Church 2.0. And so if you want to hear more about that, go check out the interview with Bo Sanders on the Theopoetics Podcast too, which he talks even more about Church 2.0, or what he's calling now interactive church. And it's also his exit interview from evangelicalism, which sounds pretty epic to me. Anyway, and by the way, we did this in kind of an echoey room. I didn't realize how echoey it was until after we recorded everything. Whatever. And like I said, we're friends, so this recording starts out with us like joking about something that I don't even want to include. All right.
He doesn't have to do that again.
That's what annoys me so deeply.
Yeah.
Well, I progressed early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't want to be there anyways.
All right, let's get into this.
Yeah.
Okay, we're here with Pastor Tim Burnett. This is, yes. Are you cringing at me calling you pastor?
No, I was nodding.
Okay. Tim, this is like a homie. And out of all the interviews we've done, this is the most homie interview. Yes. You live here in Santa Barbara, where we're recording right now, which is only an hour away from me and Kayla. And yeah, what's up, dude?
I'm wearing sweatpants, so I feel at home. Exactly. You know what I mean?
You are.
Yeah.
I'm wearing sweatpants like in my mind.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm in sweatpants.
Mental sweatpants.
Mental sweatpants.
Right.
24/7. Yeah.
So we've been doing this series on God after sovereignty, or God without sovereignty, and everyone we've talked to so far has talked about it from a very theological or philosophical and academic perspective, but none of them do actual work within churches. And you do. And you've done it for years. And yet you believe very, very different than what some people may think a typical pastor believes. So first off, I want to ask you, how did you see God when you were younger, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, good question. So when I was younger, I was basically handed your classical God, right? Mm-hmm. What we call the big O qualities: omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience. And received that without a lot of questions. I think growing up, you sort of just have this naivete about you that you don't necessarily need to question that until your life experience throws you events that you have to somehow fit into that paradigm, and that's when the evolution process starts. So I can talk about,
sure,
how that happened. You want to hear a little bit of that? Well, so as I was in grad school doing my MDiv, I also got diagnosed with cancer. So you have this ideological deconstruction as you're encountering new ideas, thinking critically about them, trying to integrate them into your perspective. Mm-hmm. And then you have this encounter with cancer and suffering and mortality and finitude. And so I started to carry these two events together, right? And it produced a whole new set of questions in me. And so really quickly, I was curious about divine action and curious about the ways in which God was involved or not in my suffering. Mm-hmm. And some of those classical answers about the big O type of God, I could no longer affirm them just right away. I couldn't just say naively anymore, oh yeah, that still makes sense. And here I am going through chemotherapy, you know? And so it led me to a place where I had to sort of read off of the, prescribed reading lists and ask new questions to people who weren't in my church or seminary, and the conversation started. So there's a number of ways that my thinking to this date has migrated, but which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah. What are some of the different traditions that you started to open yourself up to that really helped you see things differently?
Well, I had the good fortune of having a professor who was an adjunct at my seminary who was like a closet process theologian, because there wasn't very many process theologians, or there weren't really any.
What's process theologian?
Well, process theologian would be somebody who, process comes from the thinking of a philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead. Mm-hmm. And basically the process is creativity or becoming. So it's not a static view of reality. It's a flow view of reality. So you have at the very core of things, a process that's ongoing, so that we're always becoming, we're always changing.
Continuously learning and questioning and learning again.
Yes. Yeah. And not only in the intellect, right? But it trickles all the way down to how we understand things at a molecular level. Mm-hmm. So it's very much so like it's a cosmology, really. Mm-hmm. It's a way to understand the whole of the cosmos or the universe. And so process thought, is people taking some of Whitehead's philosophy in that regard and applying it to Christian theology. How do we apply this understanding of the world to what we've traditionally named as God? And then we have all kinds of fun conversations that blossom out of that.
That's super different than the package that I was given on Christianity when I was a kid. It's wrapped up all tight, and you don't ask any questions, you don't untie anything, or none of it makes sense. I like the idea of everything being in flux, but I never felt that from any of the experiences I had with religion, or with Christian religion.
And the denomination I had grown up in, its core representative verse from Hebrews, which also by the bylaws had to be on the wall of every single church in the denomination, was God is Jesus Christ, the same today, yesterday, and forever. Mm-hmm. Right. which underneath that, I feel like you can interpret that a variety of ways, but definitely the way they did was God is unchanging in every way, completely unchanging, unmoved, and So how do you see that about this God of being unchanged?
That sounds to me like a junior high yearbook signature, right? Like, don't ever change. And
Hags. Don't ever change.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I mean, I just don't think that's the way the world works. I don't see anything in our lives that's not changing all the time. From our hair growing all the time to the seasons moving and life and death and the crops being harvested. And, it's just the way things are. And so for me, again, no longer was I thinking, it has to, God or theology or philosophy has to fit into this preconceived notion that is that immutable, unmoved type of theism. And so, there's those classical immutability and impassibility that I think we sort of inherited from the Greek influence into the Christian theology. And reflects more of the kind of Zeus God constructs than the Hebrew ones. So yeah.
I think there's kind of at least what it feels like to me is saying that God is unchangeable almost makes it sound like you understand God. Like you fully understand God and you know that that's not going to change. That's kind of a scary concept to say that you understand God and that can't change. Ugh, that's such a big idea.
Yeah, it's well said. Yeah.
And what are the ways that you saw God that actually helped you with your suffering and trauma?
Yeah, so if you take a classical version of sovereignty or providence, the maybe reformed notion, then there's usually some element of predestination in every moment of our lives. And so along with that, God would have had to have been responsible for my cancer, and that I would have had to look for some silver lining or some sort of meaning in God sending me that disease so that maybe God was testing me or something like that.
God has a plan. God
has a plan for it, right? Yeah. There's a reason. And if the chemo would not have worked, maybe then God would need another angel, right? That's the rhetoric around that. And to be fair to my Reformed brothers and sisters, you know what I mean? Like, there's a variety of ways that people parse that out as well. So it's not just necessarily this sort of strong predestination that has every event, sort of predestined, but for the most part, that I think that kind of plays. And so I was dealing with those questions and those pat answers that I was being given and saying, well, what are the alternative ways to think about that?
And what were some of them that actually helped?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, Process was an introduction for me into philosophical theology. Mm-hmm. And so using the best of our wisdom inheritance in the West, I think we've got a lot of problems with the westernized form of intellect, but the best of our learning, I think, opened up a gateway for me to inhabit what I would call a theopoetics, rather than just theology proper, which is, two words put together, God and logos, which is like the word that sort of we know, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But so it kind of opened me to this gateway of saying, oh, we can get poetic with this. We can get philosophical with this. We can get scientific with this. We can do all kinds of transdisciplinary, mashups to concoct
bring more
the divine.
Out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Get our own mix going.
Yeah.
I like theopoetics. I think that's a great way to say that. It's really cool. Yeah.
And was there any religious communities that you felt like you needed to step away from as your theology started changing?
Well, I will say that the religious communities that I was a part of at that time sort of diffused me from the system as I grew to a different perspective. And so it wasn't necessarily my choice right away, but it was probably a natural process for me to no longer be in those places. And it happened naturally, I think. So, yeah.
So do you feel like people around you knew that eventually his thinking would lead somewhere else?
I'm sure that my close friends got that sense. I don't think any of us knew how it would have ended, right?
Yeah,
right. But yeah, I'm sure that those closest to me probably had a sense that, wow, this is a big shift, and things are changing, and those kinds of communities, the churches are usually, in my opinion, centered around a bounded belief set. And when we rally people around something like a bounded belief set, whether it's for Presbyterians, the Westminster Confession, and doing that kind of community, anybody who migrates outside of that bounded set of beliefs is automatically out. And the difficulty for people still in there is you either have to, sort of push them out further, or try to get them back in, but the only way to get them back in is to make them disavow where they're heading, and to sort of conform once more to the core of the community's convictions. So that's the difficulty, I think, of that way of churching. So.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've been talking about. I mean, one of the reasons that, we started this podcast is because there's these massive amounts of young people leaving the church, and it's not always because they want to leave God, but it's because they want to leave a place where they're not able to ask questions, or where they don't feel safe to be curious, or where they're not able to, kind of push their own boundaries. So it's surprising, because I feel like with finding something like process theology, it would almost kind of make you want to, leave the idea entirely when you start asking those questions. So what made you want to stay in and even be more involved?
Well, I think for many of us who grew up with the Christian story as our, Peter Berger says, our sacred canopy, or it could be another way to say it would be our lens for seeing the world is so deeply rooted in the Christian story that even as I was asking questions and going through my deconstruction process, I didn't necessarily feel the need to let Jesus go. I mean, this first century Nazarene dude walking around ancient Palestine, it's like, he doesn't have anything to do with my 21st century issues about the faith that I've been handed, right? And so there was this sense that I'm going to explore this for a while and see if there's anything to mine in the tradition still. And as I did that, I found there's plenty. So it's sort of been a romance for me, I think, of not wanting to leave behind the story I was given that was so deeply interwoven into my life and had given me so much language to make sense of what was going on in my world. And when it didn't make sense, I had to, start exploring and see if there was anything else that would help, render the beauty and the tragedy of what I was going through in a way that was helpful for me. And so I just kept exploring. And I find that once you start exploring, you realize that then you get invited to an adventure, and it never stops.
Yeah, you kind of get to push the boundaries of what you thought was possible and dig deeper and wider and figure it out for yourself.
And how did you find the denomination that you're ministering with now?
Well, it was kind of a happenstance thing.
What is it called?
The denomination? Yeah. Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Disciples of Christ.
The DOC.
The DOC.
As we
Are
say.
you down with me?
Yeah. Who's down with DOC?
Yeah, you know. Yeah, you know me. Somebody had to do it.
Yeah, right.
Couldn't just stay at the table.
It was happening. Yeah.
It was happening.
Yeah.
So how did you find that?
So, randomly was working an event with Rob Bell and Richard Rohr in Laguna Beach, and ran into an old friend and who had started working with the DOC. And we ended up grabbing a lunch that day with the regional minister for the Pacific Southwest. And I was looking for a job coming out of my last church, whose system I was naturally diffused from. And we hit it off, and I started working with one of the Disciples projects pretty soon after. Yeah. And the rest is history.
And what's the difference with DOC compared to the others you're part of?
Compared to the other denominations I've been a part of? Well, I'll just say the DOC have a few advantages, I think, that a lot of mainline denominations and some other expressions of Christianity don't have as their DNA. And a few things. One of them is the disciples think that all Christians are Christians, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't care like what one of the ways we say that is we're non-creedal. So if you hold to a certain creed, you hold to a different creed or whatever, like you're cool. Don't worry about it. You know, like we would bless anybody who wants to come to the table and be a part of what's happening. So there's that, and there's that open table is another policy, which means nobody gets to exclude anybody from the table. So that's, again, race, gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, like it doesn't matter. And the same thing would be said, I think, theologically too. Like there's no, at least the way I understand open table, there's nothing that can exclude you from the beloved community. Another thing is historically they have a high emphasis on education. So as we were chatting a little bit ago, there's this sense that you can go on the adventure of learning, and wherever your critical thought process takes you, like you're still a part of the community. There's also disciples' history is basically like we allow everyone to interpret the scriptures for themselves. So again, if you have another community that has a bounded set of this is the way we read the Bible, nobody else can read it another way. Mm-hmm. That's not how we roll. Everyone has the ability to bring their own heart and mind and lens to the Bible, and it's fine how you're engaging with it. And so those are a few things I think that are great. We ordain, LGBTQIA people, and I think that that's wonderful. And we have a strong history of working to move for social justice in our country. We just elected the first Black female head of a mainline denomination ever last year.
Cool.
Yeah, I think all that says kick-ass. So yeah.
That's rad.
Mm-hmm. That is rad.
That covers all the bases. The good bases.
Hey,
any community.
Yeah. No, I agree.
And so, in thinking of pastoring, ministering, and people helping people in their discipleship process, I think a lot of people, when they think of what a pastor does, they think a pastor is telling people about a sovereign, omnipotent, all-powerful God who has a plan for your life. You need to figure out what that plan that God has for your life. And if you veer off it, you're in trouble by that God. And if you're on it, then that God's cheering for you. Which is definitely not how you minister. But I feel like so many people think, well, that's what church is, and that's it. So So first off, what kind of God do you tell your congregants about, and how do you disciple them?
Well, I mean, when I pray in worship, I usually address the prayer to the God in whom we live and move and have our being, which is a Pauline phrase from the New Testament. And it's a way to affirm, I think, divine reality in a very open way, that causes you to have to reflect in the ways that you live and move and have your being, and to encounter the divine there. So rather than me propositionally saying Almighty God, which is what a lot of people address their prayer to, which again I think is this Greek inheritance that doesn't really even line up with the older New Testament necessarily, until it got retranslated by Caesar's editors. But so for me, it's sort of empowering people to, encounter the divine in whatever way works for them. And my friends came up with this term called hypertheism, which is a way to just basically say, we're going to, when we talk about God, which we do on this podcast, we are going to allow for a dynamism at the core of that, right? So there's no right or wrong way. I think there are destructive ways, right? Mm-hmm. Which absolutely. We can name, and that's part of the task of being a theologian and to sometimes even be a prophetic as a pastor. But we can allow people to be dynamic and to have their own experiences and to articulate them, in the way that each might. And that there's something in that freedom, I think, that sort of empowers people to really own their own theology, and so for me, so that's one way I would do that, and I don't really have that many conversations at my current church with people who are really, hungry to read heavy theology or high theory or, but when we do have those conversations, I usually bring up, love, and I like 1 John a lot. Yeah. And, but I think that there's language in love that there's not in a lot of theology language that people know, right? You know what love is if you felt it before. And that's a good place to start, I think.
So I wonder if someone came to you saying that they just got diagnosed with cancer and they don't know about some all-powerful God, the same things you were thinking through, how would you, and they're asking for advice from their pastor, how would you talk to them?
Well, so the difficulty of that question, Damon, is that pastoring, like I think anything in life, is really an art form. So how I would respond to that question would be unique, hopefully, to that person who was asking, and their journey, and and their suffering, and so there's times to answer that question with, well, God is the fellow sufferer who understands and is with you in your suffering. And there's times to respond, I think, in silence to that question and to allow for a settling of the dust, and that's the most pastoral thing to do in that situation. I think there's times to just maybe cry with people in that, and that is just as much I think a pastoral move or even a theological move than trying to get them to a new place. I don't, and I especially don't think that right when suffering gets encountered for the first time, that's not the place to tie bows up,
Maybe it's not the place to think it out. Maybe it's just the place to feel and have a person with you who understands you, who loves you, and just to create a space for them. Right.
Exactly. And I think we only come to our God language retroactively even anyways.
So what do you mean by that?
So meaning we have an experience of something, maybe transcendent, something, something that moves us in a deep place, and sometimes we don't have language to put to that for days, months, years, after that event. And so the difficulty, I think, of the theological task is trying to not to jump to conclusions really quickly. And trying to solve all of those questions. And that's why we say it the way that we hold the great questions, because we're not interested in holding the great answers, because I don't know who has those locked away. But
and tell us what the way is.
The way is a collective of people here in Santa Barbara who are choosing to be a beloved community in the Jesus way. And so we're a community of shared practices and values rather than beliefs. So back to that analogy I used earlier of communities that rally around bounded sets of beliefs. For us, we're rallying around practices and values that we agree to. So there's 5 of each. Yeah.
What inspired you to do that separately from your church instead of just the name of your church being the name of the group?
Well, it's a ministry of our church, so there's that. So there's still a connectedness to the disciples. But for me, I think that hospitality needs to run all the way down, and we need new language. We need better language. We need updated language. We need more helpful language for people than just the traditional language. And I think for some people, church is a dirty word, or a really painful word. And not everyone has that association with it, but for some people, we need to be invited into a community of people who care and be able to just be ourselves right when we walk in. And I think that's just a little bit of the heart behind choosing even a word like collective over church. And it places the emphasis, you're stacking your chips almost on a different hand of cards, I would say.
Yeah, you kind of open it up to a whole different group of people that otherwise probably wouldn't come, in all honesty. And that's a lot of people who are probably skeptical, and a lot of people who ask questions and associate the word church with, oh, I can't actually ask any questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is a dangerous thing, and it's a bad thing to feel, especially when you want to ask questions and you can't.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And as during this time of like crazy news stories of Trump administration just brutalizing scripture, like misquoting it, like talking about justifying great evils with scripture and calling themselves evangelical. Part of me hearing all this has been like greatly depressed and like making me want to just give up on the whole thing. I'm wondering, just from your own journey and perspective, do you have any advice for people who just want to give up on that, seeing that and feeling like, because sometimes I feel like, all right, the evangelicals won, Christianity is awful now, and I don't want to be a part of it.
Well, so that last framing you just gave makes me want to reinterpret the question, because if it's a game in which one of the teams is winning or losing, then, well, we need better players on our team. You know what I mean? Like, because I don't think of it that way anyways, but I know you're being playful with the language. I'm just saying, like, the evangelicals have not won. And and so I would say that for people who see that sort of systemic hypocrisy in the public light, I think the easy thing to do is to walk away. And I think that that's fair. And I think that for some people, that's probably the right move. But the challenge that I might pose to somebody who wants to just leave everything behind is that's a little easy. You know what I mean? And what in life have you ever encountered in your life that's just easy and always just kind of easy? You know, like I don't mean to dismiss someone who's walking away because of how hurt they've been.
Right.
That's not easy. That's not what I mean. What I'm saying is it would be easy to leave behind that story that we just talked about, that sacred canopy that we just talked about. And my challenge would be something just like, hey, explore a little bit before you do, and see what you find. I think we have, across our globe, we have just astonishing wisdom traditions. And Christianity is not the only one. But within the Christian stream, there's just so much beauty. And there, you know, the mystical element of it, and the liberational element of it, and the the Celtic stream, there's just so much. And I think when we decide to root ourselves in a narrative or in a stream, no matter what it is. Like, it could be a secularist narrative, it could be a Christian narrative, it could be a Hindu or a Buddhist narrative, it could be a Jedi narrative, right? When we go down to the depths of anything, we encounter something beyond ourselves. And I think that people long for that. And so the invitation stands, I think, in Christianity to keep going. And I hope that we have a generation that is exploring and adventuring into that. And I would invite anyone to do that.
I definitely think we have a generation of people who know that they need to be able to ask questions. That's part of the reason why they're leaving the church. I think that the work that you do in teaching process theology and giving people a new way, a new mindset, not a new book, but giving them a new way to read it. It's really empowering. I feel like that's kind of a word that's been floating around but hasn't been said, but it really is empowering people to be their own theologians. Is that a correct assessment?
And for process folks, relationality is the thing. And by that, if you inhabit a relational worldview, you inherently don't have a coercive or authoritarian worldview, right? Where there's a power dynamic where one person has all the information and is imparting it to all the peons or something, Instead, you have, your wisdom matters, my wisdom matters. And collectively, there's something in the diversity that we don't have just by ourselves. And so I do think that good pastors will help you go on your adventure and come up with your own language. And I wish that was actually what was happening from the pulpit most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The Christian story that I was taught is, the guy at the pulpit is definitely the one with all of the information.
Right.
And everybody stands in line to get to him, to ask him the questions. Because you can't, at least from what I've seen, they try and give leaders a little bit of ability to lead groups and things like that. But at least as a kid, I know that I was definitely punished for asking questions. And that was always very sad.
Right.
And it's,
And that's what colonizers want you to think.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you intentionally do like post-colonial ministry?
Well, yeah, there's a lot there. I think the first step for those of us who are, in predominantly Anglo communities is to help educate those people to know the story of their own land and the history of colonialism, even like in Santa Barbara. And Damon, I know you were there when we talked about that at the Way, but that's one step, I think, to help wake people up to the reality of that Western movement of colonialism. I also think that if the task at hand is to be truly relational, then we've got to hand people a community where their presence actually matters in the community. And my friend Bo Sanders came up with this idea, Church 1.0, Church 2.0, and we dialogue about it a lot. He's doing a similar project with the Methodists up in Oregon. But the example is basically at a Church 1.0 traditional church service, it doesn't matter who is there. It only matters that people are there because the service is going to happen the same way either way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And whoever attends doesn't affect anything that's happening at the service. So it's a consumer mindset, right? I come in to consume this service and I go out having
You clap, you sit, you sing, you sit, you clap, yeah.
And Church 2.0 would be like, well, when we gather, we need to leave place for relationality. We need to leave place for that conversational dynamic at the core of the gathering so that people aren't just being spoon-fed, right? So that's a way to subvert that colonizing impulse, I think. And so for him, they actually don't have a sermon really anymore. They do conversations at the center of the service. So there's always at least two people, not unlike yourselves, doing the thing together. For us at the Way, I do teaching usually most weeks, but we have like a 30+ minute dialogue in the community that then comes back to share the collective wisdom at the end. So there could be, hey, that was great, or there could be pushback, right? And then that's all welcome. So it's not like you all need to leave and then take what I said with you home and think about it for 6.5 days till we meet again. But it's leaving space for people to actually engage the ideas and the content and the experience so that they can come to their own, again, it's sort of empowering them to come to their own sense of what is being moved in them.
It's like collaborative pastoring.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, there's different modalities, I would say, for pastoring, right? There's one-on-one meetings that you have. There's teaching at a group setting. Yeah. There's pastoral care and hospice and things like that. There's different ways to do different things. But for the most part, when we're trying to curate a community, I think it's important to have that sort of relational Church 2.0 and, decolonized component pretty central to what's happening.
Do you find that people are open to that off the bat, or do you kind of have to break the ice?
What's funny is I'm not getting up there every week and explicitly describing to them why we're doing the community this way.
This is Church 2.0.
Yeah, but I think from my experience, people who have come and been a part of what we're doing have spoken back to me what I would hope that they were feeling, right? So it's like they just come to a gathering, they have dinner first for a while, and people just hang out. And then we do some little pause and poem, and we frame an idea, and then we have a conversation, and then we do the thing. And out of that, like people's responses are, oh, I feel welcome. Oh, I feel safe here. Oh, we had one person recently say that she had been in church for 20 something years and had never taken communion, and took it there in that environment because she was feeling like, oh, this is okay. Like this is me. I'm not, crossing my fingers behind my back or anything to avow something that I don't believe anyways. So my sense is that in just opening the space and doing it a different way, people naturally are feeling welcome.
And especially having
I could be wrong,
more than you'd have to get in their heads.
Yeah, right.
I feel like especially opening up a space and having other people that are with you that know kind of what your mindset is, and being able to collaborate with you and open it up for discussion, ask a question, pose a different idea. And those initial people make a big difference too. The first ones to kind of speak on the floor.
Yeah.
Make a big difference.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm also wondering, you being a minister who doesn't believe in an omnipotent, omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing God, some people may think, well, that is God. So what would you say separates you from just an atheist teacher?
I think atheism is a modern development that is responding to an empirical question about the existence of God. Generally, I would say that's what most people mean when they say they're atheists. Good philosophers, like ones you've talked to, and would probably nuance it out all the way down, but for most people, atheism is a no to a proposition about God, which is a very modern way to look at things. And I would say that for me, leaving the conversation open is really important, because I think the God conversation is the interesting conversation. Because it's the question of transcendence. It's the question of meaning. It's the question of depth. It's the question of life in death. And you know what I mean? And that's a very human question. Those are very human questions, and people who leave God behind still ask him.
Yeah.
And they just use different language. I joke around that God's on the tongue of every person, even atheists. They can't stop talking about God, right? Even if it's the God they don't believe in. It's the fascinating thing in a lot of ways. It's the question of beauty, it's the question of love. It's the question of truth and goodness. And it's endlessly compelling. I think it's very poetic. And so for me, I'm interested in leaving that room there for that conversation. And obviously, I have my own thoughts about my constructs of process thinking and things like that. But even there, process, there's dozens of ways to talk about God in process thinking alone. So, but I think we need to have a space for transcendence and aesthetics. And I don't mean that propositionally. I mean that as an invitation to the questions about it. And for atheists, the language of God is no longer resonant with those great questions, and they just use different language to talk about it. I think that's fine. And there are many constructs of God to which I'm an atheist. So. Another thing I sometimes say is if you give everyone in a room a list of 100 God constructs, we're going to be atheists in 99 pretty much, right?
Right.
So let's just stop the binary nature of it's atheist versus theist or something like that, and just say they're sort of two sides of the same coin, and we're always constructing our ideas of God. And that process of constructing, deconstructing, reconstructing is a welcome invitation.
For a really long time, I think that humans have been trying to give it their best shot
at
what's going on, and I think that when we especially, I mean, I can speak from my own personal experiences.
Yeah.
Learning this one particular version,
right,
is hard to shake when you start realizing, like, oh my God, I don't actually believe that. Oh my God, I don't believe in the Zeus god. Whoa, that doesn't feel real to me anymore. Then I start thinking about, the fact that all of the stories that I've read and all of these ideas, these are all things that humans have written. I'm capable of writing my own story. I'm capable of writing my own poetry and my own love language towards what I feel and what I see and how, I connect with other people. But sometimes it's really scary because we talked about that canopy. Yeah. And when you kind of pull that back, or I think of it as pillars. You have these pillars of how you're grown up and what your parents believe, what your grandparents did. If your family's in religion, if they're pastors, those are sturdy columns. And when those start to shift, it can be really terrifying. But I think that it's important in conversations like this, as you said, everybody's talking about God, which is the name of our podcast. Ding, ding, ding.
Great name.
Great name. Yeah, it's super important to give new processes to be able to stabilize yourself and know that it's not all, it's not all over if that idea is over. Yeah.
And I'm starting to feel like some people are thinking, God, everyone knew God is omnipotent and all-powerful, and now we're done with that. But now I'm starting to see it as there was a point where God wasn't seen like that at all. Right. And then came monarchy and kingdoms, and then they projected that on God. And now today we're like, oh, let's realize there's a beginning to that understanding that's way after the origin of religion. Yeah. And now let's just give that up and keep going forward.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I'm not oblivious to the fact that even in process thinking, we are making God in the image of our modern exploration, right? Like now God is cosmologically justified and empirically, and we're being speculative with our metaphysics now, which is very modern, right? And I'm not oblivious. So basically, just saying, I'm not oblivious to that, and this movement into postmodernism, which comes with this post-structuralist philosophy, I think is calling us to a new horizon. And I think that that's really exciting because to leave space for the divine in the postmodern world is almost to turn anew toward those very early mystical tendencies that people had about God, but in a trans-rationalistic way. And by that I mean we're not leaving the rationalism behind of modernism. We're not leaving science and technology and all the advancements of the modern world behind. We're realizing that the thousands of swipes a day on our iPhones actually aren't good for us. And if we turn our attention elsewhere, there's this thing that's been a part of the human heart the whole time. And so the invitation is really to a new horizon that is not, again, leaving things behind. It's exploring anew, but knowing that we can't figure it all out. And our best attempts, in quantum theory and, the best attempts that we have at articulating the world are actually really thorough, at least mathematically. But the question, I think the questions remain of meaning and beauty. And so I think it's a fascinating time to be doing this work.
Can you also talk about, you've told me a couple of times how you see this generation as a kind of midwifing generation. Yeah. That's really inspiring. And I think that speaks to the whole theme of this podcast. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that, so as you know, Phyllis Tickle has that every 500 years, this great shift happens in Christianity. We're at this 500-year point post-Reformation, and everyone's trying to name this shift. And I think that what is being named by this post-emergence generation is what I would call it, is really an enfolding of different expressions of the tradition. And I think that we who are doing this work in this time are midwifing that emergence or that unfolding. And we may not get to see it come to fruition in our lifetime, or I may not. I've got a few years on you all, but not too many, you know, and, you know, it might be in the generations that follow the work that we are up to, that there's some sort of grounding once more for a while before things shift again. And so I think we are getting to bring to birth all sorts of fun conversations that just happen to be ancient conversations, you know? I do think that the whole "there's nothing new under the sun," you know, affirmation is true, but in a sense, our relationship to everything is always changing. And so everything is new. And if we can say that, then we lose the addiction to certainty that we have and the pursuit as an end in and of itself to finally figure it out. And we get invited into new territory that has an open ending and is novel territory, but it's something that I think, at least I feel that we will be birthing for some time. And that's what I mean by midwifing it, stewarding it, concocting it, calling it to being, and calling it into becoming.
This could be it's going to be an interesting mix of sacred and modern, especially with with advancement in technology and our understanding of the world around us in general. I mean, we're really starting to zone in on what's going on, you know, at a microbiological level, and, you know, what's going on in space, and being able to kind of reach out and in and understand what's happening, but still asking those ancient questions. Yep.
This is beautiful. And before we go, I definitely wanted to mention that you also have a podcast that's having a very similar conversation called the Theopoetics Podcast. That word you love.
That's a good word.
So I didn't make it up. Can't take credit.
True.
It's a good name.
But what's going on with that podcast?
So, as I said earlier, I'm fascinated by theopoetics and the conversation, right? And so there's an organization called ARC, which stands for Arts, Religion, Culture, but it's a creative collaborative for theopoetics, and they do some amazing work. And so we're collaborating on this podcast where I am having conversations, not unlike you both, with certain theologians and activists and philosophers and practitioners. And so basically, Theopoetics, simply said, is a lens for doing religious reflection that puts a high emphasis on aesthetics and embodiment and experience, or art too. You know, so we think that people need to start there, or at least let those elements I just mentioned mediate the conversation. And so that's what's happening in the dialogues that I've been having. And each episode is called a Poetics of fill in the blank. And so it's been fun so far. Only a few episodes out right now.
Right. But everyone go check out that podcast. And any other thing that you're working on that you want to let us know?
No, we're here at the Way Collective in Santa Barbara. I'm writing my doctoral thesis this year, but that's yet to be fully explored itself. So
TBD.
Oh.
Yes,
and that's on processing stuff too, right?
Yeah, it'll be looking at how what's an accessible way to talk about this. It'll be looking at how moving toward an event-based ontology rather than a substance-based ontology, meaning like that becoming notion of happenings, like the core of reality is made up of these little events that are waves or energies or emotions, instead of, substances like bumping up against each other. If we really start to conceptualize our lives in that regard, so we start asking questions about reality and personhood and soul, then how does that both affect and transform the way that we understand the Christian spiritual journey? So that's what I'm exploring with process thinking.
That's good. Awesome. Thank you for being on. And
thanks for having me.
Of course. All the links to check out Tim and The Way and all that will be in the description. Yeah, thank you for being here.
You're very welcome. Thank you both. Yeah.
And there you have it. If you want to check out more of Tim's stuff, make sure you check out the Theopoetics Podcast. If you want to find out more about the Way Collective, check out waycollective.org. All those links will be in the description, don't worry. And thank you so much for listening to these interviews about these different ways we can talk about God. Like I've said in these previous episodes, we're not trying to make you talk about God in the correct way. That was not the purpose of this series whatsoever, but to get you to see there are so many ways to talk about this God. And when you are able to be free in that realization, you're able to freely explore and realize, oh, there are other healthy and helpful ways to talk about this stuff, different than what I thought there was. And so that's why I'm so thankful to have this podcast, to be able to put out these resources like this. And let me know if you like this whole series. Let me know if this series challenged you. Let me know if you want to keep talking about this subject matter. I actually thought I was going to have some more to say about this stuff after this interview is over. Even maybe doing like a whole episode where I just keep talking about this stuff, but I feel like we've talked about so much. It's like almost everything has been said. It almost feels like it's like there's so much that you could just go back to and listen to these 4 interviews again and again and again and keep getting more and more out of it. And so it's like everything that could be said has already been said, right? Anyway, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next week's podcast. We are back. We are really, really, really back. And I'm probably going to do that episode soon where we talk about what the heck was going on when we were gone for so long. So thanks everyone for sticking around. Check us out at God Talk Pod on Instagram and Twitter. Follow me at Instagram and Twitter at WhoIsDamon. Hit me up. Thanks for listening. See you next week. Bye-bye.